So what you see we've gone through here in Southern California for thousands of years is a roller coaster. Sometimes we have too much water, sometimes we don't have enough water. And these things can wax and wane from year to year, but also decade to decade. Decade to decade. If you look back in the historical record now, actually the 20th century was relatively wet compared to the past 1,000 years. And if you look at a proxy record like tree rings on the Colorado River, we had 125-year droughts on the Colorado, where it was in a negative phase of the PDO. Can you imagine how dry that was? And of course, whole civilizations disappeared. The Anasasis, the civilizations in Meso and Central America during these great droughts. All right. So we've actually been pretty fortunate. When we achieved all our growth here in Southern California, it was an extremely wet century compared to previous centuries. That's pretty scary. So, the El Nino, you get rain, positive PDO, and then you get a year or 2 decades where it's extremely dry. I don't know, some people probably remember the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, some people in this room remember how dry California was. Right? But like I said earlier, there were only 4 million of us in Southern California in the 1950s. Now there's 20 million of us. Okay, let's look at it again. All right? The El Niños, they're wet, dry. But the important thing, the red line, see the 50s, where it's relatively dry there, average rainfall is more like 12 inches. In the 80s and the 90s, those are the big phases of the PDO, where you can get 10 or 20 years where it's really dry or where it's really wet. And those are the things that drive people like Bruce crazy, right? Where growth is going up, and he's looking at 20 years of below normal rainfall. Now, I always said the future ain't what it used to be, right? Now, what does that mean? It's drier. I just told you there's no long-term trend in rainfall. Let's look at the Colorado. Colorado essentially is the great watershed that becomes Wyoming and Montana, Nevada and Colorado. All the winter snowpack melts in the spring and feeds Lake Mead and Lake Powell. Now, you can see again, notice that in this is the trend, which is going down. Notice in the 1950s, the Colorado had less flow. 50s and the 60s. So it looked just like the rainfall in Los Angeles. So it's a huge pattern. It's not just the rainfall in Los Angeles and Sierra Madre, it's the whole West. And then in the 80s and the 90s, when we had the positive phase of PDO, we had so much rainfall and snowpack, Hoover Dam actually overflowed in the 1980s. All right? And of course, recently here, you can see what's happening in Lake Mead. So the average is about 15 million acre feet. But you're never going to see 15 million acre feet in the long-term average. Now it's more like 10. So when people plan for growth in California, they use numbers up here. For instance, the Metropolitan Water District. And when they sign contracts, there are 7 states and 3 Indian nations that take water out of Colorado. All right? So when they signed all the contracts, it was for these kinds of numbers, not this kind of number. So that's when Mark Twain says, in the West, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. We've been fighting about water, all right, for 100 years in the American Southwest. When the original treaty was signed, it was somewhere in here. And you notice that the wettest 20 years in the 130-year history was in the early part of the century when they signed the treaty. And then after that, of course, everything just plummeted and we went into the Dust Bowl. So that's kind of interesting. But see the long-term trend. It's down 20% over the long term. Whereas rainfall in Los Angeles is not down, but flow on the Colorado is down. So Lake Mead actually hasn't been this low since 1965. Now let's look at the Sacramento. The Sacramento, we actually get more water in Southern California from the Bay Delta, from the Sacramento. That's where the great reservoirs are, Lake Oroville, Lake Shasta, and essentially they feed the Bay Delta. Well, you see the same thing. You see a long-term trend. 20% decrease in the flow in the Sacramento at the same time that the growth is going up. So the growth is going up, supply is going down. Supply and demand. So let's look back about a year ago. This is what Lake Oroville looked like. It was really down. Now we had a pretty good winter. So right now it's at about 77%, which is good. It's really good. And Lake Shasta is actually, you know, almost flowing over. Because there's a lot of water in our two main reservoirs. Whereas Lake Mead is still below 50%. And below Lake Powell is even lower, all right? But here's the lake level in Lake Mead, which is one of the great sources for water in the American Southwest. And you can see that dip there in 1965, and where it's at right now, compared to the 80s and the 90s, that's really low, all right? That's unprecedented low. And so as we look out into the future, and the population center of the country shifts from the northeast to the southwest, all right? And it's really growing everywhere. Las Vegas, Arizona, New Mexico. You think it's growing fast in Southern California, try Arizona, you know, or Las Vegas. And so there's a problem, all right? Because, all right, we're looking at a new normal. Everybody talks about what's normal, what's average. Well, in the American Southwest, there's a new normal. And the new normal means the growth is too fast.